I come from a tradition where language is power. There's no distinction between the two, and you think about the value. This is very Borgesian framework influence, that the power different registers, different phrases, different accents have in different social spaces. So you can think about the way, if you're giving a formal presentation, what kind of language is going to be seen as appropriate or valued versus if you're hanging out with your friends. And language has a very, not only in terms of what it's going to get you on a particular market. So if you pull out a British accent, for example, in maybe a Berkeley context, you might be seen as more erudite, having, I guess, more intelligence would be the very crude way of saying that. Versus, so that's gonna get you something. But there's also sort of the idea that language is, as a part of discourse, is what structures society. It's the way in which information is organized, the way in which meaning is made. And that's hugely important to the way we interact with the world.
Why is it so important for educators to kind of be aware of this, right? And I'm even thinking about like G, where he does that analysis of preschool kids' stories and the teacher culturally identifying with certain kinds of stories.
Yeah, exactly. And so that is such a classic example of discourse styles being sort of juxtaposed in a classroom and being valued versus not valued. So there's a young, I think she's seven-year-old African-American student who is talking about puppies and birthdays and sort of this circular, very oral sort of presentation narrative that she gives. And rather than sort of accepting this narrative, the teacher is trying to form, trying to ask questions about reporting, sort of what happened when, to sort of form her narrative into a more academic sort of reporting of facts in a chronological order. But what G does really well is showing how her story is actually sort of this circular, very detailed and very layered narrative that has a very distinct and profound moral. But the teacher nonetheless is trying to correct it and sort of make it fit into this different mold. And a mold that she finds in another student's narrative, and this is a white upper middle class student who is able to follow that mold from the beginning. She's able to sort of construct this narrative that is according to more academic discourses. And so you really see the power, a student who doesn't have access to these linguistic resources, these literacy resources, is already seen as behind or deficient, and the teacher is trying to get her to move past her own discourse and literacy practices toward sort of this power-infused dynamic. And I think what's really important about academic literacy is that it isn't seen as a neutral discourse, right? It's not just there. It's not something that sort of just happened. It was the discourse practice of a dominant class that instituted into the school system that made it valued. And it's not, so when you're teaching students this discourse, I think it's super important that it's presented as such, that it's not sort of neutralized and sort of you need to know this because you need to go to college. It's seen as a way to distinguish yourself as having a particular background and particular social class. And what concerns me about, because when you don't, if you just say students need these things, they need the genres of power, you are doing a disservice. You're pulling a veil over what's really happening, and you're not. Students deserve to know why it is they need to know these things. And I think by giving them back the power in understanding where this fits in sort of a power framework, you give them the context, you give them the background, you give them the chance to have opportunities to push back against that, to say, well, okay, so I understand that these are the practices that are going to open X, Y, and Z doors, but I'm also, because I understand that that's the way it works, I can also push that. And there are ways to sort of fight back, I think.
And you mentioned